Hello, my name is Emily, and as we go into 2025, a brand new year, I am very excited to be talking about books from 2024. I read 90 books last year, and today I'm going to discuss with you my most memorable reads from 2024. These are not necessarily my favorite reads, but they are the ones that I think I'm going to remember into coming years. As time goes by, these are the ones that are going to really stick with me, for better or for worse. So let's get into the list in no particular order. Starting with The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I was not really intending to read this memoir, but I decided at the beginning of 2024 I was going to read all of the Goodreads Choice Award winners from the previous year, and this was one of those. And I actually really liked it. I think that there were, certain issues I had with it. I thought the writing was meh. I thought that maybe she hadn't quite processed through her experience in a way that she could really explain it clearly. But the story, her story and what she went through, that I will remember. I found that to be quite shocking. Shocking, but not surprising, if that makes sense. It was just awful. And the fact that this happened to somebody not that long ago, and probably very similar things are happening every day. This is a woman who we probably would have thought of, before all the Free Britney stuff, we would have thought of her as like being pretty powerful, and she had money, and it seemed like she should be able to run her own life. And so the fact that she wasn't allowed to do that, it's going to haunt me, I think, for a long time, what I read about in her story. Book number 2 is A Girl Called Samson by Amy Harmon. This is my first book by Amy Harmon. Unfortunately, the memorable part of this book is bad. It's the story of a young woman in the Revolutionary War who dressed as a man to join the Revolutionary Army. Incredible, right? And it's based on a true story, which I was very excited about. I thought that sounded so interesting. So the first half of the book, I loved. I loved that, her whole story of like wanting to join the Revolutionary Army and all of this, and joining and trying to hide that she was a woman and going through all of the challenges of that. That was absolutely fascinating. The second half of the book was about her having a romance with the general that she worked as his secretary. And I kept thinking, this seems so unbelievable, and not just unbelievable, but kind of problematic because of the power dynamic between them. And I found it really cringy. I did not like it. Now, to be honest, I don't really love romance as a genre, so maybe that was part of it. But I just found, the power dynamic really got me. I felt like, this doesn't feel right, But I thought to myself, well, if that is the real story of this woman, then I can understand why the author wrote it in this way, because she wanted to be true to her real story, even though it's a little tough to read as a modern woman. I can see why she wanted to be true to the story. Come to the end of the book, and I read the author's note, and as it turns out, that part of the story was not real at all. In fact, that was totally made up. There was no romance in real life between this woman and her general. Actually, these two were married to other people. And even worse, the general's wife, his real life wife, in the book, she actually did make an appearance, but she died. But in real life, she did not die. Eventually she died because this took place a long time ago, but she lived through this whole thing and had a whole life, and they had children together and all of these things, and it was great. And that was a very difficult pill for me to swallow, that not only did they have other spouses and everything, but the author just thought, I'll just kill off this real person who did not die so young to make room for this completely fake romance. That again felt very problematic to me. So yeah, I did not like that. I thought that was honestly disrespectful to these real people. I could not. So yeah, I'm gonna remember that, and I'm gonna remember my rage over that for a long time. Another book that's memorable for maybe not the best of reasons is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This is the first Sarah J. Maas book that I've read. She has absolutely taken Book Talk by storm, Bookstagram by storm. Everybody is reading Sarah J. Maas. So I thought I'd go ahead and read A Court of Thorns and Roses and see what the big deal was about. And I do not understand the hype behind this series. I really don't. Now, I have heard some people say the first book is not that great and you have to get deeper into the series. And to that I say, the first book should always be great. I have no patience for that. If the first book is bad or like a throwaway book or like it wasn't the author's best work, I'm not gonna keep going. I'm sorry. I need the first book in a series to be great. And it just wasn't. There's so many things that I could say about it. But I think the one thing that I'm going to say is it drove me insane that this main character was such a dolt. She wouldn't take responsibility for anything. I mean, she literally murdered a fairy. And then her punishment was to go to this palace and have everything she could ever want and be taken out of poverty and not even be imprisoned there. I mean, she could leave if she wanted, basically. That was her punishment. She was so mad about it. She thought she was just being treated so horribly. And I was like, maybe you should ask yourself, why is this considered a punishment? Because this is actually great for you. It just made no sense. And then every time somebody told her, hey, don't do this thing because it could kill you, she was like, no, I think I am gonna do that thing. That sounds great. I'm not gonna be told what to do. I could not stand her, and there were so many other things, honestly. But I do not get the hype around this book. I don't want to be judgmental, but I don't get it. I really don't get it. So I think what I'm gonna remember most about that book is just not understanding why anybody would like it. Next, we have The Women by Kristen Hanna. This is another book that absolutely everybody was reading last year. Previous to this, I had read The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I felt like Kristen Hanna was using the real trauma that people went through in World War II as a way to kind of emotionally manipulate her readers. And that was very difficult. It felt like she just threw in like every bad thing that could happen into the story so that she could get her readers really just emotional over this. That felt kind of icky. Even though I thought the book was very, readable, I could understand why so many people loved it, but it just felt like there was so much just horrible stuff poured into it. And reading The Women, I felt the exact same way. It just felt like she took all of these various things that happened to various people from this time period and she put them all into one character to just destroy her readers emotionally. And I think there's just sort of a fine line, between telling the truth about like real things that people suffered in order to shine a light on that versus using those traumas as, a way to further your own career and make money. It was hard for me. I felt like she veered a little more on that side, which I didn't love. Not that I think she was definitely doing that, but there's just something, and also like the manipulation of the readers obviously every novel is going to manipulate the reader emotionally in some way or another, but it does feel like, again, there's kind of that fine line between doing, the normal amount versus like absolutely trying to destroy your readers. That being said, I do think that this book was very memorable. Maybe because of all the excessive amounts of trauma that were in it. I really actually did enjoy learning about the Vietnam War and the women who were part of that. That's just something I'm gonna remember for a long time. And I'm grateful that I read it. I liked it. I shouldn't say that I disliked it or anything. Just, it didn't make like my top list of the year of books that I loved the most, but I did like it and I thought it was very, very memorable. Next we have The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. I loved this book, and I think what makes it really memorable is the main character, Martha Ballard. She was a real person, and I actually think that the author did a good job of representing her life. I loved reading a story about an older woman, well, not old, but like middle-aged, a middle-aged woman who has a family and is happily married. I feel like that's so rare in historical fiction nowadays. I thought she was such a great character to read about. So that one I'm gonna remember. Now let's go in a totally different direction. The next book is First Fly Wins by Ashley Elston. This book was kind of a thriller, but not I feel, your traditional thriller. You have this character who is doing this sort of undercover job. And at first you don't really understand what's going on, and you sort of uncover layer after layer after layer as the book moves on. I'm not going to spoil it, but I just thought it was really interesting from a literary standpoint. I don't think enough people are talking about that. I think it's just like, oh, the suspense, and I feel like people are sort of just placing into the category of a regular thriller. But I really thought this novel did something so interesting. I've read a fair number of thrillers. I wouldn't say it's my main genre or anything, but I thought this one stood apart from the crowd. First of all, I'm not even really sure I would call it a thriller. I feel like it kind of transcends genre a little bit. But I loved what the author did with this concept of first lie wins. The character tells us pretty close to the beginning of the book about this idea that when you are being dishonest with somebody, your first lie is the one that they're always going to believe. Even when they find out later that you've deceived them or something, they're always going to believe kind of the first thing that you told them. Yeah, I don't really want to say more than that because I don't want to spoil anything, but I loved what the author did with that concept, and I've continued to think about that and just find that really clever. Next, we have My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. I absolutely loved Rebecca. I know lots of people have read that one. Fantastic book. One of the most memorable reads of my life, probably. I read that several years ago. So I was excited to read My Cousin Rachel, but I didn't have high hopes for it because I know that Rebecca is probably most loved because it's the best. I do not think that it tops Rebecca, but I thought it was really good and really interesting. This is another one that I just kept thinking about it. So you have this main character who's telling the story, and he has this cousin, Ambrose, who basically raised him, and they're very, very close. And Ambrose always says he'll never get married. He'll just be a bachelor forever. But then one day Ambrose goes away to Italy and he meets his cousin, Rachel. They start getting along really well and they end up getting married. And he starts sending letters back to this main character. Honestly, can't remember his name. But anyway, the main character his letters start getting weird. And he's saying some very strange things about Rachel. And so the main character is starting to really be concerned over this. And I'm not going to go any farther, but there's a lot that happens with this character. And I just found it really fascinating. I really don't want to say more because I do not want to spoil it. I will say, as far as like big reveals, if you're looking for like some big plot twist or something, you're probably going to be disappointed. But I don't think it was a plot twist that made the book great. I think it was the characters that made the book really interesting, and just the things that they did and ways that they interacted with each other. That was quite fascinating. Next, we have The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence by Gary Haugen. This is a nonfiction book, and the author is really involved in this nonprofit organization that is really trying to help people find justice in the world who have had violence leveled against them. And it's really, really fascinating. I mean, everything you really need to know is there in the subtitle, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. It definitely convinced me of that. And it really showed how you have to start by ending violence against people who are in poverty before you can try to help them in other ways, like financially and educationally, things like that. You can build a school for girls and like put a lot of effort into that. But if girls know that they're going to be assaulted on the way to school or at school, then they're not going to go. And that's just an example. There's many, many other examples in the book about this. All of these other initiatives are very good and they come from a good place, but not enough people are acknowledging that no matter how hard people work, if violence is taking away everything that they're working for, they're not going to be able to get out of poverty, which is of course really sad, but it was also, I think it's an issue that's really important. I'm glad that I learned about it. Not that I can really have any impact on this, but I hope that people who are in more powerful positions around the world will read it and maybe will be able to change something in that area. Next is By Any Other Name by Jodi Picoult, and I found this book absolutely fascinating. I thought the execution of it was not totally my favorite, but the idea behind it was one that I'm gonna remember for a long time. It's a story about Shakespeare's works and what if they weren't really written by Shakespeare, and what if some of them, at least some of them, were written by a woman. And it tells the story of that woman. It was a dual timeline, and the modern day timeline I did not really like. I loved the historic timeline though, and I will tell you that I was convinced that Shakespeare did not write his own work, which I've never really thought was a very incredible. Like, I've always just thought, oh, you know, people always look for reasons why somebody didn't write something, whatever. But there was a lot of good evidence. I thought she had really good arguments. I don't know if I was convinced that this particular woman was the author of any of his work, but I think she could have been. And I think there's a lot of evidence that somebody or multiple people were the true authors. So that is something I'm going to be keeping in mind for quite a long time, maybe the rest of my life. Last, I have the Briar Club. This is definitely one of my top favorite books I read this year. It's by Kate Quinn. It's about these women who lived in a boarding house in the 1950s. It's a novel, and just each of their individual stories and how they kind of came together. It begins with this mystery. Somebody was murdered at this house. And so that's sort of the mystery, is who was murdered and who did it and how did it all come about. And so that sort of unfolds throughout the book, but it's very much a character-driven book. This mystery is sort of the underlying thread that connects everything, but it's not the main plot. So the main plot is really about these women and their individual stories and how they came together. And I think what really took this to a very memorable place for me is one of the women named Grace, who's kind of was the main character of the book, who really brought all of these women together and made them all friends. I just loved her, and I don't want to get into too much about her and her story because that would be spoiling. I loved her character. I loved her origin story. I was very surprised by her origin story. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And she's definitely a character that is one of my favorite characters I've ever read about. I just really liked her. So those are my most memorable reads from 2024. If you want to see my top 10 actual favorite books, you can follow me on Instagram. I did a reel about them over there at Emily Hubbard Writes. And I will hopefully be back coming to you with another video very soon. Let me know what your most memorable reads were in 2024 and why. I'm very curious. Happy New Year!